Pleasure to welcome you once again for what is our last event for this season, but we have already lots signed up for the next fall. Our it has shifted. Anyway, the other image was up for a second before. Our 25th conversation. Really has been a great pleasure to see you all very regularly, and we'll continue that. I'm Dietrich Neumann, I'm the director of the John Nicholas Brown Center, and tonight is in many ways the culmination of this entire series. And I couldn't be more pleased to introduce Barnaby Evans at this final installment of our series. And of course, everyone knows Barnaby Evans, so I can keep this short, but there was so much in his CV that I wanted to talk about that I'll take just 1 or 2 minutes to tell you about it. Everyone knows Barnaby as the creator of Waterfire, of course, this amazing public art installation that has really changed the urban fabric of our city. Fewer people know that he went to Brown University, and we're very proud of that fact, where he studied biology and environmental science. And that, of course, as you will hear tonight, is a topic that still deeply interests him. He has also worked as an artist in the medium of photography very successfully. His works are in the collection of the V&A, Victoria and Albert Museum in London, in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire in Fribourg in Switzerland, the Addison Gallery in Andover, at RISD, and many others, and have been exhibited around the world. He has actually won many awards for his photography. And among them, I'll just mention one because it's again a local figure, the great Aaron Siskind Fellowship in Photography. And apart from photography, his medium also has been installation art. There are many installations that he did. I'll just mention 3, maybe. Riku's Second Dream was a great installation at the RISD Museum. Heart of Glass in Tacoma, Washington, or the amazing Moving Water installation in Boston that took the emerald necklace and the water system there as a topic. But back to Waterfire for just a moment. The first fires went up in 1994 on first night. I remember I was there, it was really cold, and I thought, that's very interesting, that's never going to happen again. Then, however, very wisely, the next time he lit the fires was in June 1996. The second fire was warm and pleasant, and it suddenly looked like something that one would want to see more often. And it became an ongoing installation in 1997, which means that this has been 25 years, but of course we lost a year or two to COVID in between, but Waterfire has been going strong since then, and not just in Providence, which of course is the main location, but also in Rome and Singapore and Houston, Columbus, Tacoma, Kansas City, and Sharon. I didn't know about Sharon, that's pretty cool. Yeah. So he has brought Waterfire to different locations, but it's worth remembering, I think, that Waterfire is not just what the title seems to suggest, namely cauldrons of fire on our 3 rivers. There's also carefully curated music, there's installation art, there are performances, there's a very careful reorientation of public urban space. For many years there was ballroom dancing in front of the, as you probably all remember, in front of the Turkcet building. And there's of course plenty of merchandise. And perhaps most importantly, there is a real urban ritual with its gestures, timing, different roles for participants, even a dress code with the anticipation of the crowd before it starts, and the celebration and commemoration of events and community members. It is, as the Germans would say, a true Gesamtkunstwerk, which means an all-encompassing work of art. What Barnaby has done for our city is truly immeasurable, although I think one can probably say very safely he has brought in millions and millions of dollars from tourists who came to visit for Waterfire. But he has also given our city an identifiable image. Countless photos of Waterfire have been on magazines and presented Providence as one of the great American cities to live in. And he has given us a pride of place that didn't really exist before. I should mention the Waterfire Art Center, where we saw each other last just 2 or 3 days ago, that he turned into not just an exhibition center and organizational hub for Waterfire, but also a place that inspired a whole area of the city, gave it new life and new connections. Much has happened there, and you can have amazing coffee and fantastically distilled drinks in that area of Providence because suddenly there's life and interest and people streaming towards it. Barnaby has been honored many times. I'll just mention a few. The Kevin Lynch Award from MIT, the Rudy Bruner Award for Urban Excellence, He was inducted into the Rhode Island Heritage Hall of Fame in 2011. He was awarded honorary doctorates. Here's the Honorary Doctorate of Humanities by Brown University, an Honorary Doctorate of Fine Arts by Rhode Island College, an Honorary Doctorate of Humane Letters from Roger Williams University, and an Honorary Doctorate of Fine Arts by Providence College. I could go on, but I won't, because we want to hear Barnaby. I just want to ask you to help me welcome Barnaby.
Thank you, Dietrich. Thank you, Dietrich. That was way longer than 2 minutes, and we agreed I didn't need an introduction, and then you went on and on and on. It's great to see you all. I'm glad you're here. This building, I was asked whether I'd been here as a student, and I don't think it was open to students when I was here. I was here from 71 to 75. But I've had a lot of connections with this building, and just in asking that question, it reminded me of several of them. One of them was, I know Rob Emlin, who lived here for a long time as it was in the transition of becoming what it is today, the John Nicholas Brown Center for the Public Humanities. And Rob lived upstairs, and I used to visit him, and I actually photographed the building, and I think you still use the photograph I made many years ago. But Rob told me a story I have never forgotten about this building, which is, as you know, it's one of the largest wooden structures of its kind here, and I seem to be wiggling something. But it has gone through many transitions, and it originally had gas wall sconces everywhere and gas chandeliers, and at some point, probably rather reluctantly, knowing the Brown family, it was electrified. And I'm sure, and they kept the gas for some floors and the electricity for other floors. And unbeknownst to everybody, Rob Emlin discovered that they'd use the gas pipes for the conduit to run the wires, but they also still kept the gas running through the conduits. So depending on what you did on the floor, you could unseal the gas and have a gas fixture burning, or you could use sort of bubble gum to seal up the gas and have the wires poke out, and it could be electric. And it ran that way for generations until they started to do the renovation and discovered that this was not really up to code. But it's very sort of Yankee ingenuity. Why would we run something extra? We've already got a pipe going through the house. So I've never forgotten that about the house. And of course, John Carter was a big fan of Waterfire. As you know, when he was at the National Gallery of Art, one of his main missions was bringing people into the Public Art Museum and wanting to demystify the arts. And he was fascinated with Waterfire. We had several conversations. He was enthusiastic about it. We lost him at far too young an age. One of many funerals for him was in the garden here. And then the third thing I remember is this specific room. I worked with a public humanities scholar years ago to do a piece about slavery. I'm trying to remember what year it was. It was on the 200th anniversary of the abolition of the international slave trade. So it's probably about 2003. Does that sound about right? And we did a piece called 1,000 Ships that we sort of co-imagined and did it. But following it, we had a conversation in this room where we invited many members of the community to have a conversation. And we voted not to film it. We had the ability to film it, but we chose not to film it, and we were all in a circle around this room. And it was the most extraordinarily honest conversation I've ever seen on the complexities of race and the legacy of slavery and Brown. And that was a long time ago. I've never forgotten that conversation. We were sitting on this rug. So there are many, I've got many fond and curious memories about this place. So welcome. I'm going to invite you. We have a show up right now, and I'm not going to review it because I want you to go see it, but I'm going to talk about some of the thoughts in putting it together. But I also want to invite you to see it. It's up at the Waterfire Arts Center, and it's up for another week and a half or so. It's up till May 1st. I do urge you to see it. Something is loose here. Let's see if we can settle that. Check the input terminal. needs a password. I think maybe it just timed out. I think it just timed out. And if you're up for it, we actually have a reception there tonight, which will have about 200 to 300 people there, and it goes till 9 o'clock. And you're very welcome to come by and join it. Of course, there's never any charge for anything at Waterfire, and see the work for yourself. I'm going to talk a little bit about it, but first I wanted to give a little background for why I was interested in it. This is a composite of 2 drawings of the building complex where Waterfire is, which was first the Burnside Rifle Works, and then the Rhode Island Locomotive Works, and then they amalgamated with some other locomotive works, and it became the American Locomotive Works. And then they stopped making the locomotives. So that's Valley Street on the right. This channelized river is the Woonasquatucket, and the Nicholson File Building would be over here. And upstream of here was not the pristine river you see up there, but was U.S. Rubber, although that came a little bit later. Bannigan built that there, where he made the famed Woonasquatuckets, which were knitted wool booties that he impregnated with rubber to make them waterproof. And was suggesting that they were based on the Native American moccasin, that it was a sort of hybrid creation. But one of the things that when we look at the environment, which is what the exhibition is, we need to realize the extraordinary transformation and improvement. This is the American Locomotive Works, if I can read that. No, it's now it's no longer Rhode Island, it's now American Locomotive Works. So this is Valley Street, this is the Farmers Market, this is Hemlock Street. Tremendously heavily industrialized factory. We don't have many photographs of it. And what you'll notice when you go to the Brown and Sharp facility, or the American Locomotive, or even U.S. Rubber, or Nicholson File, there are usually vast parking lots there. That's because they've torn down the really big buildings and they saved the kind of small ones because they were for offices and something like that. But the big foundries, they've all torn down. But the heavy industrial past of Rhode Island is an echo that's always here. Our building was a brownfield hazardous waste site. It sat empty for 50 years. It was built in 1929. They sort of went out of business a little bit after World War II, say in the 58, something like that. And for about 50 years, it was lightly used because the lightning strike had hit the southeast corner and gone down the electrical leads and blown up a bunch of transformers, so that it had a dioxin contamination problem both inside and outside. And those are very unpredictable things to work with. This is India Point, not that long ago. Just to finish on that, so it was estimated at $2.3 million to clean just that up. We spent $2.5. We were lucky. Sometimes you keep digging and digging and it gets a great deal more expensive. But again, this is what we now enjoy as India Point Park. One of the first railroad stations was here. This photograph is about 1910, something like that. And it was coal from the Seekonk. This is from East Providence, from what we call Fort Hill. It was coal receiving and shipping from the Seekonk River all the way to Allens Ave and Fields Point. 45 separate coal landing facilities. 75% of what was coming into the Port of Providence through World War II was coal. And this soil is extremely contaminated. Wickeden Street would be actually there's the spire of the church, but that building was, there was a park there. This is another view of the same thing. Now you can see also on the East Providence side. And this was even further down in the East Providence side. These are where there's now a park that they're sort of working on out there at Bold Point. This was, again, loading coal onto rail going throughout industrial New England with coal dust, noise, pollution, consequent various other things. And there are dozens of pictures, some of which, different ones, are in the exhibition. So the core thing at the exhibition, I'm just going to show a few pieces. This is Luke Jerram's piece, which is called Gaia. So in 2019, for the 50th anniversary of the Apollo mission landing on the moon, we did an exhibition with Luke Jerram as well, where he had made the moon, a 7-meter diameter, 23-foot diameter moon. And when we did that, he started to think about doing a version of the Earth with NASA imagery. And we arranged with him that we had wanted to do it for the 60th anniversary of Rachel Carlson's book, Silent Spring, which is this spring. This is the 60th anniversary. And it's about the 51st or 52nd anniversary of Earth Day. But this particular image, which was referred to as the blue marble, was what the astronauts saw in the Apollo mission. It was before they landed on the moon, but as they got, as they successfully orbited, they couldn't see this, but as they got further away, as they experimented on the trajectory out to the moon, they suddenly had this astonishing vision of the Earth, the entire Earth, as a sphere in the middle of the dark, lifeless, cold void of inhospitable space. And they called it the blue marble, and they took a photograph with a Hasselblad in color, and that came back to Earth when they landed. It was on the cover of the Whole Earth catalog, and it inspired quite a few people. And in combination with Rachel Carlson's book of 12 years earlier, we had the first Earth Day in 1970, and then in 71. It inspired many of the things that have cleaned up the messes I was just showing, from the Clean Water Act to the founding of the EPA and things like that. There are a lot of interesting issues, social issues here, which we're seeing now. There was tremendous pushback from the chemical industry about Rachel Carlson's book, and she was accused of being a meddling housewife who had no idea what she was talking about. She was actually, this was her 4th book. She was a much respected and quite thoughtful and very articulate writer about science. So she was absolutely correct in what she was saying, and she was fairly conservative about it. But she would have been flooded off the airwaves if President Kennedy's science advisor hasn't said she's right. And there's now, as we know with the cigarette industry, there's been an ongoing program of distortion, denial, confusion, and if you're interested in the complexities of this, we'll have a couple more lectures left in the series here, but I'd recommend on next Thursday night at 6:30 we're going to talk about the future of public transportation in RIPTA, but at 7 o'clock Timmons Roberts is going to talk about the oil industry's efforts to subvert any societal action, and just how devious and how many paths there are. If you saw, just in fact, the confirmation hearing for the Supreme Court Justice, they kept, well, I won't even name them, but they kept talking about her softness on cases for pedophilia. And pedophilia seems to be a sound bite that they've worked out in these private conversations where they get a sense of where the electorate is as a hot button issue. So they sort of are raising it with no justification. I mean, it goes to QAnon, and it's preposterous, but they've noted that it makes enough of the population so furious that they don't listen to reason. So it's part of a deliberate campaign which is being funded in part by the oil industries just to prevent any sort of progressive action becoming into law. And it's widespread. Timmons is going to talk about some of that. And so that's on the 28th, and I'd encourage you to come if you're interested. So with Gaia, the phenomena that the astronauts saw when they saw the planet from this distance, the first thing they realized is how much of it is water. We say that, but it's another thing to actually see it, and we're so used to seeing projections and maps that are favoring the land and distorting the area of things, that we do. It's really quite impressive to see it in the round at scale, and to see that Antarctica and that ice which has threatened to melt is larger than North America. So it's a tremendous amount of ice between the Arctic and the Antarctic, and this is some of the problems of what we're unleashing. So the intention of the exhibition is to do two things. In the larger room, there are 51 artworks by 17 different artists from 1827 to 2022. And the choice of that date is because in 1826 was the first published article where we began to speculate whether burning all this coal was going to change the weather. And that was ahead of the greenhouse gas understanding, but greenhouse effect. But that's the first time where actually, and what it was coming from was people seeing the soot deposited on the snow and the early melting of snow in more industrial areas. And they began to wonder, gee, and with a planet this size, we never sort of imagined we could have that kind of impact. So we're looking at different cultural representations of how man intersects with the environment from all the continents except Australia. I had an Aboriginal piece I had wanted to include in the show, but it was too fragile, and once we sort of worked out whether we could borrow it, too expensive. At that point, it'd have to go by air freight. So we don't have Australia represented, but we have many different cultures in the show. And a philosopher in Boston viewed the effect of the astronaut seeing of the Earth at this distance, the Overlook Effect. And so the first thing you notice is how much water there is. The second thing you notice is on these gigantic continents, you don't see any borders. All these wars we have are entirely invisible from an outside observer. And the third thing you realize, which you don't see so much in Luke Guyham's sculpture, although it's quite impressive and huge in the space, is that the thinness of the atmosphere that supports life. So that's often, if it's backlit, you can see, and the atmosphere, of course, diffuses out to, tropospheres and different levels of smaller and smaller density, or lighter and lighter density. But if you think of the atmosphere as sufficient oxygen, say, to support human life, so that even Mount Everest most people need supplementary oxygen for Mount Everest. So at the scale of this Earth, that's about 3/32 of an inch thick. So it's a very thin little film in which we can survive. And that overview effect led many of the astronomers to try to work and try to understand how to make progress in this front. And that's the intention of this exhibition. Because the science is fairly settled, at least in principle. The models are very complicated. And the reason why the models are so complicated is they've got to model in what our societal and behavioral and individual responses are going to be in addition to the physics of the situation. So that a lot of that variability in trying to make an estimate of the rate at which things are happening is to determine, can democracies sort out these sort of problems? One of the, trying to remember what it's called, one of the phenomena in AI when they look for artificial or extraterrestrial life, not AI, extraterrestrial intelligence, is we haven't found any in the universe, and there are a lot of technical reasons why that might be related to the distance or the just the range of places you might have to look or what frequency it might be. But one of the I thought I lost the mic. One of the theories, which is called the Fermi Paradox, like why haven't we found them? But one of the darker theories is that any species that's going to become capable of working out intergalactic travel or space travel is going to be technologically adept, but also going to be fairly aggressive in terms of its, it's sort of, you're really going to need planetary resources that you're going to have acquired. And one of the proposals for the Fermi Paradox is that kind of drive, of that commercial self-interest, is inevitably going to lead to the demise of the civilization because it can't control the use of oil or nuclear power or whatever it might be. So there's a darker perspective on that. If we just show the blue marble, which still looks gorgeous even with current NASA imagery, we're not looking at the problem. So in the show, we're also, I think it timed out because I talked too long on the first slide. Dietrich, I think it's going to need, okay, good, it came back. So here is some other pieces. This is Joan Hall's piece on the upper right. That's about a third of it. It's a 36-foot piece sculpture called Algal Bloom, and it's a piece of handmade paper and glass that's representing the sort of exponential growth that can happen when nutrient pollutions get into waterways. And the piece on the left, called Twin Fires, is a piece by a sculptor who's managed to capture the atmospheric effects of fires and water and smoke in a truly astonishing way. These are all fairly large-scale sculptures. This is called Twin Fires, and it's in response to the burning of the oil wells in Kuwait by Saddam Hussein, and the destructive power of that and its impact on the environment. These are 3 more sculptures by Richard Friedberg. I'd encourage you to come look at them. They're pretty extraordinary, and just for a sense of scale, they're pretty big. So again, we have an opening tonight till 9, which is a party with an open bar, well, a cash bar, excuse me, and you're all welcome. But the show is up till May 1st, Sunday, May 1st, and I do encourage you to come by. This is the Mendocino Firestorm. It's about, I think it's 16 feet high. One of the pieces we have in the show, probably the most famous artist in the show, is Judy Chicago. And this is a piece that's always been important to me that isn't sufficiently known by Judy Chicago, and we were very pleased to be able to show it for the first time in this form on the East Coast. We have 3 pieces by her. This is a piece from 1972, and it comes from a body of work from Judy Chicago's, which was way before the Dinner Party Project, which she started in 75 to 79. This was work she did in California, it was called the Atmospheres Project, and it's a specific send-up of what we call the land art movement, which was happening in sort of response to the Blue Marble and Earth Day. So for example, you'll recognize Robert Smithson's spiral jetty in the Great Salt Lake, or the asphalt pour, or people like Michael Heiser's bulldozing of the desert in this piece, or although this piece called Double Negative. And what Judy Chicago was doing was saying, the hip thing right now is to look at the environment and the earth, and suddenly all the artists are doing stuff with the land. But almost all of these things are sort of testosterone-driven bulldoze adventures, which are incredibly destructive of the land. So yes, you're claiming that this is part of an environmental response, but it's actually quite destructive. And so she created a whole series, and there are about a dozen of them, of sort of ritual healings from the perspective of ecofeminism, which felt that there was a linkage between the sort of patriarchal approach to land and the economy and ownership, and sort of this masculine driven ego. And so they did a series of healing ceremonies in the land which didn't control the land, but she deliberately called them land art. And it was a very thoughtful and kind of focused message. So these she's returned to for her big show at the De Young Museum that ended in January, and she created a new series of these particular works, which are at a much larger scale, and we're the second people to have shown them, so we're very pleased to have 3 of them here in Providence for the show. We also talk some in the show about the science of some of the environmental disasters we have here in Rhode Island. And this is the Reverend Ezra Stiles, who was the congregational minister in Newport for many, many times, a very educated man, a man who considered himself a man of science. And in this painting by Samuel King, when he was in Newport. You can see, and I've enlarged them a little bit on the right, both this, he learned Hebrew from one of the Jewish residents in Newport at the time. And this is a reference to sort of the celestial model, but this is also both Newtonian and Pythagorean references to gravity and the ellipses that has to do with the planetary motion. So he considered himself an educator as well as a scholar, and a scientist as well. He was a good friend of Benjamin Franklin. He's here because I want to talk a little bit about one of the major ecological disasters we have in New England, and sort of fill out a story so it has a little more context. This is the silkworm, the Asian silkworm, and its most desired food source, which is the mulberry tree. It prefers the white mulberry tree. I'm not sure why it's showing a red mulberry tree here, but it greatly prefers the white mulberry tree. And in Rhode Island, there's a silkworm named Oliver Cromwell, actually. We'll get to that in a moment. But in Rhode Island, a lot of our wealth, particularly in the early period, was through fabric. If you think of Slater Mill and all the water mills which were making fabric. And for several centuries, we had wanted to capture the most lucrative fabric you could make, which was silk. So they were always trying to establish a silk industry in southern New England, particularly in Connecticut, but also in Rhode Island. And it led to all sorts of environmental disasters. First of all, we find mulberry trees all over southern New England because everyone encouraged people, and there were awards for doing this. It was, in fact, many of the churches required their parishioners to plant mulberry trees, because the big worry was this very successful silkworm industry was going to run out of enough mulberry leaves to feed the Asian silkworms. And they planted thousands and thousands and thousands of mulberry trees. And now it's a sort of perennial weed all over southern New England. It's an introduced species. It's been fairly benign, but you'll find it everywhere. And that's where it's coming from. It also led to a huge series of frauds and financial panics where people were selling mulberry trees and guaranteeing they were going to be so valuable when they went up, and there was several crashes in it. But Rev Styles was an avid proselytizer for the silkworm industry. And he often preached about the industry of the worm, and he kept some 300 silkworms in his home. And I had the picture of it, but I decided it was going to get too long if I did too many pictures. He had about 300 silkworms. This is from his Journal of the Silkworm. He had a name for every single one of the silkworms. This is Oliver Cromwell. And every week he would measure them and weigh them and do a little sketch of how they were doing. And in this, it's interesting, he's using 2 14/20. I didn't realize 20ths was a measurement we used, but everything's in 20ths in this journal. And in fact, there it says 7/20 for the diameter. So that seemed to be a fairly uniform piece of measurement at the time. He kept this journal for 17 years. There are many volumes of it. It's in the Beinecke Library with many, many drawings. And he only stopped growing silkworms in his home, and his whole family was involved. His wife helped and the kids helped, was when he became the president of Yale. And so he sort of stopped feeding little white worms and sort of took over for little white boys in New Haven, and was still the president when he died. But he was still very actively interested in sericulture. So here's the next character. This is Etienne Trovalo. I don't know if the proper pronunciation of the T there, but I think it's Trovalo. He was a French astronomer and artist and worked at the Harvard Observatory. And he decided that one of the problems was all these mulberry trees, and so he imported what we used to call the gypsy moth, and is now called the spongy moth. It's renamed it was renamed the day all of my panels arrived, so I had to reprint them all. And he deliberately brought it into the country, into his home, in his house, and there it is, in Medford, Massachusetts. And he was trying to breed a cross between the Asian silkworm and the gypsy moth, because he really felt that the problem that southern New England had about trying to capture sericulture as an industry was the moths didn't like our winters, and the mulberry trees didn't like them either, although the more robust ones did survive. And so he wanted to come up with a hybrid caterpillar that would eat anything in Rhode Island. He was in Massachusetts, so let's say southern New England, survive Massachusetts winters, and produce useful silk. So he got an A+ on eating anything in Rhode Island, and he got an A+ on surviving our winter, but it turned out, and the reason why we call it the spongy moth is it actually doesn't make silk. What it does, it exudes sort of a foam for its eggs. So that turned out to be a bust. And he abandoned that project, but a storm came up and a falling branch ripped the screen in his backyard of his insectaria, and 3 to 5 of the caterpillars escaped. I believe this was in 1878. He notified the authorities because he knew this was bad, and they couldn't find them. But the authorities were not particularly interested in the problem. What could a few caterpillars do? Well, they got more interested in the problem when all the trees in Medford died about 12 years later. And then for about 40 years, there were very aggressive efforts to capture the gypsy moth, including thousands of people employed like this. This is one of this. They were in 40-man crews. They had 20 ladders, 40 men, plus a cook, and they had literally hundreds of people marching across the landscapes, in this case climbing trees to capture gypsy moth or spongy moth caterpillars, unsuccessfully. And then we tried poisoning with cyanide and then arsenic and got lots of people sick, but the caterpillar didn't mind those chemicals. And now we're using biological controls, but those biological controls are having a negative effect on native insects that should be here. So this is just an example of how much damage. This is about $1 billion worth of damage every year right now, just in the United States. It's also in Canada. So in the science section of the exhibition, we run through about 20 of these stories with photographs and talk about, and I called this unweaving the ecosystem, where we just didn't know what we didn't know. And we often hear these technological solutions from Elon Musk and people like that really don't recognize how delicate these ecological systems are, and that we just don't know what the unintended consequences will be. I was going to give another example. This is one of my favorite pictures of the Woonasquatucket. This is Olneyville in about 1910, and these are the immigrant children and the workers on a Sunday swimming in the Woonasquatucket River at not a developed park. It's now where Merino Park is, so it's the mill ponds upstream of Olneyville. And it looks like it's right out of a Parisian painting of the period. And there's some other photographs on the same day by the same photographer. But one of the things we look at in the show is a little bit about how we think about public space and the natural environment. And in this case, this is a mill pond caused by damming up water for water power, which had all sorts of ecological challenges and problems with the fisheries and rivers and flooding and things like that. But it has this side too. So I wanted to just do one other story that we tell in the exhibition. So this is a hand-knotted contemporary, maybe 10 years old, Afghanistan carpet, and I'm looking at the Persian carpet here. And this is in the exhibition because it is another statement of a societal perspective on mankind's relationship to the natural world. And this pattern in both Persian rugs and Afghanistan rugs is called the Paradise Garden motif. And it's, first of all, it goes way back before 1827. This goes back to about 400 AD with the first of the Persian paradise gardens. But what it's referring to is the 4 rivers that come out of the Garden of Eden. So, repeat after me. We got the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Gishon, and the Pison, I think it is, Pisot maybe, which are smaller. But you'll notice how they become sort of Cartesian and very rational and at right angles. And so it's referring to also the 4 seasons and the 4 cardinal directions and this very geometric, rigid, intellectualized vision of what the natural world was, almost in service to man. And with many plants we use, from cotton to opium to papyrus. And this is a perspective, both a Persian perspective and Afghanistan perspective, and these rugs are still made. Most of the work, by the way, in the art shows for sale, including this rug, which is 9 foot by 9 foot, if you need to know that dimension. But in the Arabic culture, you never name a price, so this is a silent auction. And it's got wonderful detailing in it of the different fishes and birds and plants. And I use it as an example because I wanted to talk about the different ways we think of parks. So I started with this homemade park, which the community created of themselves in the mill pond. And then we've got this vision of a park or a garden, a paradise garden. And then we've got these two. And some of you will recognize these two. These are the great 2 poles of the American landscape movement around 1850. The gentleman on the right is Frederick Law Olmsted, both the hero and the bad guy of our story. And the guy on the left is Horace Cleveland, who is certainly, we would consider from our perspective now, the hero as opposed to Olmsted. But Olmsted was doing something really, really interesting in his parks. He actually wasn't particularly, he was a farmer, he grew up the son of a farmer, and he was a farmer, but he wasn't particularly interested in the landscape or the park per se. He was much more interested in it politically and philosophically and with respect to transcendentalism, and this idea of creating a place that had horizontal equality and a place where the idea of American democracy could actually flourish. So his design, so he didn't have strong alleys, but he did have a very structured, almost romantic space. So we get to Horace Cleveland because Roger Williams Park, they considered Olmsted to design it, but instead they chose Horace Cleveland, who is the sort of correct choice in many respects. But the original land that Betsy Williams willed to the city of Providence, which the city of Providence did not want and rejected for several years, is in yellow. So that's the entrance area. And all these other lakes, this was all other privately held land that was not part of the park. So this is that section that is the entrance. Right now the zoo's taken over. Let's see, I'm turned around. The zoo has taken over. Did I put this in backwards? Yeah, okay, so this is the entrance right here, and the zoo's taken over from here over. And later, the casino would have been built there, and the Roger Williams cottage is right there. So Horace Cleveland, here's his design, and that's actually smaller than the drawing on the screen. It's a massive drawing that you can see at the Roger Williams Museum of Natural History. It's a little bit bigger than this. He was based in Chicago at this time, and you'll notice he doesn't call it the design of Roger Williams Park, he calls it design for the arrangement of Roger Williams Park, and that's your first clue to what the huge battle between Cleveland and Olmsted was about. So Olmsted was very interested in the idea of the park, but he wasn't particularly interested in the naturalness of the park. In fact, he didn't particularly want a natural park. if you'll notice the design of Central Park, much to many people's complaint, it didn't have strong axes and things like that, but it did have these spaces that you would go through where people would interact with each other, but you were always sort of discovering something around the corner. So it was really interested in the psychology of the space. Cleveland was interested in the ecology of the space. So Horace Cleveland did not do what Olmsted did. Olmsted, first of all, dynamited everything in Central Park, including bulldozing out the black community lived there and a lot of other impoverished people who made their life, their living, and raised their food there. And then he dynamited anything that was left. A lot of the stone was imported from Pennsylvania and Connecticut. And then he decided he wanted a lake here and another lake here and a stream from here to here, and those were pumped. They were artificial, they didn't have the grade. So there's a lot of behind the scene underground manipulation, and he would bring in trees that weren't native and things like that. Whereas Horace Cleveland felt the exact opposite. So Olmsted's main goal was this psychological idea of building sort of equity in the space. But he didn't have any of this sort of sense of groundwater or ecology or preserving the natural native plants. So there's been somewhat of a reversal, whereas with what we look at now, Cleveland felt that basically you could arrange the roads through the existing park, but you had no right to rearrange what was there, both because it was God-given and it wasn't from a religious perspective. It was more that all these things had co-evolved together and everything belonged where it was. And so the reason why the city didn't want to accept this land was it was a bunch of swamps and some rocky outcrops, and basically it was everything that Betsy Williams couldn't sell as farmland. And now she was giving it to the city, and the city said, we don't want this junk. But eventually, with some of Horace Cleveland's perspective, so what Cleveland would do was he dug the swamps out, but made the lakes exactly the shape that they were, kept as much of the old growth as he could, and planted new trees as well, and then would sort of thread the roadway through to provide different views and to accommodate himself to the existing contours of the land. And this is still entirely naturally fed by the water table and springs and seepage from one lake to another. And then if I showed you earlier, all these other owners of land said, wow, there's something we can do with these swamps. And many of them donated to the city, some of them sold it. And there were subsequent design things that brought in these very architectonic elements, like the Temple to Music, which was a behest from a gentleman who lived on Stimson Street to make a Temple to Music specifically. He was an olive oil salesman on South Main Street, and he paid for the whole thing. I don't think he saw it completed. But it wasn't designed by Cleveland or by Olmsted. Olmsted had some consulting capacity in some of the rest of the park, but they more or less kept this idea of Horace Cleveland of looking at the natural park. So those are some of the perspectives that I wanted people to think about. And then things like the bandstand or the casino, these came later. These were not things Horace Cleveland would have put in, or the Japanese garden, for example, which is not the right species or the right water flow. And always looks a little bit murky. And there's the Temple to Music, which had the lead soprano from the Metropolitan Opera come grace its steps when it opened in 1924 or 26, something like that. So I'm going to stop there, but I urge you to come see the exhibition. And it's up till May 1st. So any questions or further thoughts? Or? Of course. No question is at all? Yes?
How did the gentleman identify the individual caterpillars that he was naming?
I have no idea. That's a very good question, because he had as many as 320 of them at sometimes. Sometimes there were fewer. They may have been in individual cages. You're talking about Rev Styles. He was quite the polymath. He was a trustee at one of the founders at Brown. He got very upset with Brown because he wanted it to be rigidly non-sectarian. And so he wrote the original charter proposal. It wasn't originally in Providence, but he wrote the original charter proposal, and when it went to the State House, the Baptist-leaning legislators made it more of a Baptist college, which it never really became. But in its original charter, Stiles had wanted it to be absolutely ecumenical and to have no religious requirement and to actually have no religious feeling. But he was very interested in science. We couldn't find my notes, but there's some funny descriptions of Stiles as someone who really enjoyed science but never had any original ideas in it. But he was looking at electricity. He was a correspondent with Franklin and things like that. So this effort to start the silk industry is very early. You know, it was about almost a 300-year effort. But I can't answer that question. I had the same thought myself, and I suspect that Oliver Cromwell was occasionally confused with other people.
How could you tell them all apart?
I don't know.
Too many
Yes.
children. Did sericulture ever take off in Rhode Island?
No. Well, it turns out that sericulture is pretty difficult. Even if you're using the silk from, there are garments made with silk. In fact, Stiles has a dress at the Beinecke Library that he made from Rhode Island silk from his silkworms. The problem is there's a lot of labor involved later. The way sericulture works is the silkworms get nice and fat, and when they're happy they make their cocoon and go into the moth stage. And then what you do is you want the moth to leave the cocoon because you want it to lay eggs and produce more silkworms for yourself. But the discarded cocoon, there are a couple of techniques. You can put it in boiling water or steam it, and you can get one thread of the silk, and you can very laboriously unthread it, and then you can wrap 3 together to make a thread, and then you wrap 9 together to make a larger thread, and eventually you can make silk cloth. In the papers at Yale, there's a description of someone who tried to sew a jacket for a young boy of Rhode Island silk and said it was so strong it broke many needles. Now they're hand sewing. So I don't know, so we did produce silk here. Connecticut was probably the most successful of capturing the sericulture industry, but it was so labor intensive and so subject to failure from either the machine. You have to then you then have to still make the fabric from it, that it never really managed to take off. What killed it eventually, so they were still trying, was the introduction of polymers and nylon, because there was still this absolute fashion demand for silk. And fashion is one of the odd, curious features of our economy. So we think of the silk need now. The fashion industry is probably one of the most devastating industries from the environment of everything. It's frivolous. A good example is blue jeans. Levi Strauss, who invented the blue jean for the gold rush in 1849 and wanted to make a really indestructible garment. So gold miners from California, in their will, they'd probably didn't manage any gold, but they have a couple tools and they have a couple pair of blue jeans. They'd pass the blue jeans on to other people because they were that indestructible. Nowadays, in the current fashion industry, we take the same fabric grown with cotton, which uses a lot of pesticides and a lot of labor. Then we turn them into jeans. Then we acid wash them and stone wash them so they'll only last for about a year, a garment that could last 30 years solely for the fashion statement. It drives the ecologist absolutely bananas. And URI has a new program. We just had a presentation by the head of fashion design at URI where they're pointing out that using polyester, which can be recycled, is a much smarter approach than using something like either wool or cotton, which, although they're natural, have very large costs for raising the animal or the plant and harvesting it. Whereas polyester, you can completely recycle, melt down, make fresh yarn, change the color, and reuse forever if you can figure out how to make it a closed cycle economy. Very different perspective.
But that all comes from the oil industry, doesn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they're saying, but that's using oil, but you're not burning. He said the stupidest thing you do with oil is burn it.
Yeah.
You know, it's actually kind of useful if you make it a closed loop economy. Yes, it's entirely coming from oil.
Yeah, the Persian garden rug,
Yep.
that's only 10 years old?
That's, well, I don't actually have an actual date on it. It was recently imported from Afghanistan. So we were estimating it was probably 7 to 9 years old.
Oh, so it's 1790?
No, 7 to 9,
7 to 9.
not 1790,
Right, yeah.
no.
Yeah.
This is probably a very old rug. And this, again, you can see the plant elements. I was just seeing the same pattern for cotton in it, and many beasts and beasts attacking deer. So it's a very traditional element in Persian carpets.
And with that rug, I mean, you displayed it on the wall.
Right. That's intended to be on the floor.
And that would have been its intention originally, as opposed to being a floor.
No, it's a floor carpet. It's a carpet to be on the floor. Yeah, I just, I felt if I put it on the floor, people wouldn't realize that they're meant to be looking at it as an object of a culture, and that I was afraid that people would, so then we were going to put it on a stage so you could see that it's an art object. And then after inquiring with the Afghan community, they said, well, put it on the wall. So we put it on the wall. So it's hung on the wall. But no, that's a carpet intended to be part of the home.
I was seriously considering putting a bid on it, not having any idea what it would be worth.
Yeah.
But because fortunately my daughter has a large enough wall that she could put it.
She could put it on the wall or on the floor, absolutely. And that's cotton. It's cotton on wool, so cotton hand. Any other questions? Well, do come see the show. Dietrich, you've seen it. I think you enjoyed it. Yeah, this is
I loved it, can highly recommend it. I have two quick announcements before we thank Barnaby. One is, of course, as always, come and join us for wine and food. And April 2nd, next week, we won't have a lecture, but we have the big opening of Jasmine Lee Johnson's installation in front of the wallpaper, interpreting the wallpaper in our
Oh, yeah.
hall. Same time, and food and drink will be provided. And as
Thursday.
always, I must say, Barnaby is one of the sort of most imaginative, smartest, and inquisitive minds I've ever met. It's always a joy to hear you, Barnaby. Thank you for a great lecture.
Oh, thank you.